For today's classic interview, we are going to an interview I did a couple of years ago, about 2.5 years ago, with Marc Hyden. And Marc Hyden is against the death penalty. But what was interesting about Marc Hyden is that he's part of a group called Conservatives Against the Death Penalty. And I thought it'd be interesting to check out that interview, especially now in the context of Donald Trump talking about wanting to execute drug dealers and actually expand use of the death penalty. Also in the context of all the problems that many states have been having getting the drugs that are often used in these lethal executions, lethal injection executions, and Oklahoma, as we talked about on the bonus show last week, using nitrogen gas for these executions. Let's go back to why, even by conservative standards, as Marc Hyden pointed out to us and made abundantly clear back in August of 2015, the death penalty is something that as a developed Western nation, we should be running away from. And slowly but surely, we are going in that direction. The question is, will we, and if and when we will get to a ban in all 50 states on the death penalty. I think that there will probably be some holdouts there. My interview with Marc Hyden. I'm joined today by Marc Hyden, who's the National Advocacy Coordinator with conservatives concerned about the death penalty. He comes most recently from the National Rifle Association, where he was campaign field representative in the state of Florida. You know, Marc, I think this is probably the first time on the show that we're having a former NRA person on, because we just agree with you so much from the conservative side. And I think increasingly people are understanding that there's really nothing very conservative about the death penalty, is there?
Well, you're absolutely correct. When you look at the death penalty and you look at what principles conservatives hold dear, they just don't line up. Conservatives believe in pro-life policies, but the death penalty risks innocent life. Conservatives also believe in fiscal responsibility and restraint, but the death penalty is far more expensive than life without parole, and it's even led to tax increases. And we also believe in limited government, but I don't believe there's anything limited or wise about giving an error-prone state the power to kill its citizens. So I think it's antithetical to conservative principles.
And this idea of the government having as little involvement as possible, if we sort of think of the conservative idea of the government should take the smallest action possible to have the best possible outcome. I was recently looking at a study showing that harsher sentences, including the death penalty, do not actually have a deterrent effect on crime and do not actually improve the sort of status quo around crime. So why would the government take what I think we would all agree is a bigger action, right? The putting to death of someone, if we are not even getting that desired impact of either deterrence or whatever else it may be?
Well, conservatives like to do cost-benefit analyses, and I like to do the same. So I asked myself, for a big broken government program like the death penalty that has a high human and fiscal cost, what do we get out of this? What's our bang for the buck? And truthfully, we don't get much. You're right. The death penalty does not deter murder. The states that are the perennial leaders in executions actually have the highest murder rates. And if you look at states like New York and New Jersey, their murder rates actually went down once they repealed the death penalty. But if you go beyond public safety, because we know the death penalty doesn't deter, you also are confronted with the fact that the system is very harmful on murder victims' friends and family members because of the long, drawn-out process and the incessant media attention.
There's another way. You know, I read about your position on how the death penalty fails the families of the victims. I think there's another way to consider also, which is that when you say, well, certain types of crimes are worthy of the death penalty and others that may appear just as heinous, but maybe it doesn't involve a multiple murder, it was just a single murder, doesn't it in a sense risk devaluing the sort of the victims of what has been determined to be a crime that's not quite bad enough for the death penalty, but bad enough for life without parole? It starts to sort of categorize the different victims and affect their families as well.
It does, and conservatives, you know, we pride ourselves on valuing life, but that kind of valuation is inappropriate. It's saying some lives are worth more than others, and that's how the death penalty works. It's very arbitrary. If you look at the race of the victim, if it's a white person who may or may not have been murdered by a person of color, there's a higher likelihood that it's going to turn out as a death penalty case as opposed to life without parole. And that goes back to, you know, Lady Justice is supposed to be blind, but apparently she's not colorblind.
So let's talk a little bit about what you think, as someone who is working within the conservative world, as to why the death penalty is so appealing to many on the right. Broadly, I've talked about this idea that exists on the right with regard to many social policies of sort of strict father morality, as George Lakoff has put it, which is we're going to put aside for a second, as you said, the cost benefit analyses. We're going to put aside for a second the facts on deterrence, because sometimes we just have this innate sense that people deserve to be punished in a way that we see fit. Am I onto something there? Is there some other explanation that you see as to why so many on the right really like the death penalty?
I had a conversation at the North Carolina GOP convention. Someone came up to me and they said, I support the death penalty because I think that some people just deserve to die. And I told them, I'm not going to argue with that line of thinking. That's your own opinion. But do you trust an error-prone government to fairly, efficiently, and properly administer this program when you don't trust it to deliver a piece of mail? And the light bulb went off in his head and he walked away being against the death penalty. We have to look at this program not in a theoretical framework, but how our government actually operates it. And it operates it in a very, very flawed fashion.
Is that, in your mind, the best way, speaking as a conservative who has convinced other conservatives that the death penalty is a bad idea, is taking a sort of we don't trust the government approach the best way to change other conservatives' mind on this? Because there's so many arguments that could be made, right? There's the cost argument. There's the risk of innocent life argument, and we've seen increased data that suggests 1 out of 25 on death row is not guilty of the crime they've been convicted of. What, in your mind, is the best argument? And maybe that one is it, which is, listen, we don't trust the government, and we don't want them putting the death penalty on anybody.
Well, I found that one to be very convincing, but for me, it's the preponderance of the evidence. I used to support the death penalty, but once I looked at it in a conservative framework and I noticed all of the problems, all of them together is what pushed me to finally come out against the death penalty. And, each person is different. Some people are led by the cost arguments, which I'm a fiscal conservative as well, but others are not swayed by that, but they're swayed by the life issues or just their distrust of government. So every person is different, but there's no shortage of reasons to oppose the death penalty.
Nebraska is a recent conservative state that has repealed the death penalty, and your organization played a role there. What is it that you do on the ground to try to get a repeal going? I mean, what are the sort of logistics involved?
Well, it takes years of planning, and our involvement in Nebraska was part of a broader coalition. So there were a lot of different organizations that were involved, and it went on for years. They were working with legislators, persuading them, showing them the information about the death penalty. But they were also working, and I was working as well, with the grassroots and grass tops in Nebraska to get them to contact their legislators and let them know which way they should be voting. They should be voting the way of their conscience. They should be voting the way of their principles. And after years of pushing towards this, Nebraska finally repealed the death penalty, and they did so by overturning a filibuster as well as a veto override, and became the first red state in over 40 years to repeal the death penalty.
So what can individuals do who still live in states with the death penalty? Is starting with their most local of legislators the way to go, writing to senators and U.S. members of Congress?
Well, I'm a conservative, and I like to think that politics is best done on a local level, on a state-by-state legislative basis, and that's our focus, is to try to repeal the death penalty at the state level, because that's where it's used the most. Only 3 people have been executed at the federal level in the modern era, so mainly it comes from the state level, especially states like Texas. So I recommend, they contact me, go to our website, sign up, and also reach out to their state representatives and state legislators and start a grassroots movement in their own local areas.
Is there some hope, even though, as you say, most of these decisions are made at the state level, that we could see what happened with marriage equality happen with the death penalty, which is at a certain point it becomes very clear that at the state level there is this preponderance of desire, so to speak, across the country to say no more death penalty, where there might be some sort of federal or Supreme Court ruling on it. I guess the question would be, what kind of a case could broadly challenge the death penalty to the Supreme Court? That's where I see sort of a tough hill to climb. But is there some possibility of federal action on this?
I mean, there's always a chance. I mean, capital cases are going to the Supreme Court with regularity, and Yeah, since Justice Roberts has been put in place, I've given up on trying to figure out which way they're going to rule on anything. So it's always a possibility that the Supreme Court will weigh in.
Hmm.
Recently, they looked at the Glossop case having to do with the potential of cruel and unusual punishment, and some of the more left-leaning justices came out pretty much opposed to the death penalty and stated the many reasons why they can't support it, regardless of that individual case. So there's always the possibility that in the coming years that a Supreme Court ruling may come down and end the death penalty nationally.
Last thing I want to touch on, as a conservative who on this particular issue sides more with the sort of prevailing left-leaning opinion in the U.S., on what other issues do you find yourself having maybe more natural allies on the left?
Well, we're a single issue organization, so I usually
No, but you
stick
personally, I mean.
Oh, me personally? Well, I believe in limited government, and sometimes that means that I align more with libertarians as well as some on the left. There's a multitude of issues that could come out from that, but when it comes to my voting, it's usually pretty much, or it's always on the Republican line.
Yeah, that I'm not at all surprised to hear. All right, we've been speaking with Marc Hyden. He's the National Advocacy Coordinator with conservatives concerned about the death penalty. Thank you so much for talking to us about this.
David, thanks for having me on.